Hi, everyone. This is Robin Riddle with Brain Support Network and Stanford University. We're so glad to be able to join today with Dr. Boxer. It's kind of an exciting day here because Brain Support Network was mentioned in the New York Times
Oh,
today,
wow.
obituary. That's cool. We just did a brain donation for the mother of one of our local support group members, and sad that the lady passed away. Family donated her brain. That was her wish to donate her brain. And it turns out she's a famous actress. She was in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. If you
Oh,
remember that movie, it was a very cool movie. So we're getting a lot of phone calls and stuff. Hey, what's this brain donation stuff all about? So I imagine at some point Dr. Boxer will talk about brain donation. But I wanted to introduce Dr. Boxer. We are so lucky in the Bay Area to have him right here. He is one of the world's experts in PSP and CBD. And the reason I say he's one of the world's experts is that back in 2011, there was a Nature Genetics article published looking at 1,000 people's brains of those who had autopsy confirmed PSP. And my dad's brain was one of those 1,000 brains. And as a comparison to the people who had autopsy confirmed PSP and CBD, the researchers picked, there were only like 4 or 5 neurologists in the United States who they said, okay, their neurological diagnosis in a clinic is as good as a pathologically confirmed diagnosis. And Dr. Boxer was one of those few experts whose clinical diagnosis was deemed to be about as good as a pathologically confirmed diagnosis. So he has definitely bona fides in this space, and we're so lucky to have him. So I'm going to stop talking and let Dr. Boxer give a short presentation. We'll have lots of time. He's devoted lots of time to Q&A, and you can enter your questions into the chat and into the question and answer box, and we'll go from there. Okay, thanks, Dr. Boxer.
great. Well, thank you, Robin, for the very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So what I wanted to talk about today is that these are really exciting times, I think, for us in PSP and CBS research. And just as a bit of background for people who don't know me or what I do, I'm a behavioral neurologist at UCSF and the Memory and Aging Center. I've spent my career over the past 20 years trying to, a large part of it at least, trying to develop treatments for PSP and related tauopathies. And so this is really very near and dear to my heart. And I do my best to take care of patients with PSP, CBS, and other related FTLD and other disorders. And I have very strong opinions about what we need to do to make progress towards a cure. And I think we're making some progress, which is exciting. I mean, we still have a ways to go, but I didn't have time to make as many new slides as I would like, but just to say that, you know, some of the barriers that we have faced historically in doing research on PSP and CBS, we're starting to surmount in much more. And so I think that's really exciting. And I think that, you know, again, the ultimate goal is a cure for these diseases. And I think increasingly it's seeming, you know, I'm becoming more and more optimistic that we can get to this point during my lifetime. And, you know, maybe even soon, maybe well before the end of my life. So not to be too pessimistic, but so one of the, you know, the challenges I think that we've historically faced is that from a therapeutic development perspective, there just haven't been enough treatments that have been tested for PSP and CBS or CBD patients because you know, many of the treatments are tested by pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies, and you know, they haven't you know, traditionally wanted to invest in these diseases, but I think increasingly we're seeing a lot more interest in that. Part of the reason why there hasn't been a lot of investment is that There are concerns that it's hard to diagnose people accurately with PSP and CBS until they're really quite affected by symptoms, and there's a worry that that some new treatments might not work unless they're started very early. But I think we're making progress with diagnosis. We're making progress with new treatments, and particularly that I'll just tell you a little bit more about is it's exciting times in general for the field, because in Alzheimer's disease, there's a bunch of new treatments that have just been approved, and they're specific to Alzheimer's disease, and they don't really necessarily, they can't be used in PSP or CBS, but they sort of are very instructive in how we can get to the point where we will find good treatments that can slow and hopefully eventually stop the disease. And so this is, I think, really energizing all of us in our efforts to develop treatments for all of these diseases. I think the other thing that I'll tell you a bit about is that historically not only has there not been much investment in PSP research or CBS research by industry, but also by the federal government in the form of the NIH, National Institutes of Health. But we're very excited that we expect to receive funding for a big new project soon. We don't have the check in hand yet, but hopefully in the next couple months. And we think that's also going to really accelerate the development of treatments for PSP. So let me see if my slides will advance. So just, one thing that I've been trying to point out to people all over the world is that, there's been a lot of work done in ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and including a new congressional mandate to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on ALS. But ALS really, if we look at the prevalence here, which is a measure of, on average, how many people have the disease per 100,000 people in the population, the prevalence of PSP is nearly identical to ALS. But what you can see at the bottom in all these epidemiological studies is there's like literally 10 times more studies have been done in ALS. And if you look at the amount of money that's spent by the US government and other governments and private foundations for ALS research, it dwarfs PSP. And so, I think something that we can all do as researchers and as patients and families and people who care about people with PSP is really speak out loudly and advocate with the research institutions, but also with Congress, and to lobby Congress, because that's how ALS just got a huge amount of money for research, is by talking publicly and convincing politicians to actually write a bill and get it funded or get it passed to provide funding. But all this being said, we are making a lot of progress for PSP, but I think advocacy really plays a role here too in increasing the amount of funding. And it's really, if we had more funding, we could make progress a lot more quickly. This is just a slide that I showed a lot of different talks, and just to show that really what we think is central to the disease and causing PSP, but not just PSP and many other brain diseases of aging, is this protein called tau that was initially studied pretty heavily in Alzheimer's disease, because this dark brown stuff, and these are different stages of Alzheimer's from left to right and top to bottom. And the more of the dark brown stuff, that's tau protein, that accumulates, the worse the severity and the more advanced the disease. This is measured, these are brain slices of people who passed away at different stages of disease. And it's the same in PSP and even in other brain diseases like chronic traumatic encephalopathy. In PSP, these are these are schematics of people who have more severe disease, and the amount of color represents the amount of tau protein in their brains. And it's a different distribution, and I'll tell you in just a minute, a different type of tau than we see in Alzheimer's or other forms of brain degeneration. But it's what we can, the good thing for us is that there's a lot of effort and a lot of investment in Alzheimer's tau drug development, and we think many of these drugs may also work for PSP if we can just test them. And so basically there's a general thought that this protein tau, something goes wrong with it in most brain diseases of aging that leads to the nerve cells and other cells in the brain, something goes wrong, and then the cells die, and that's what leads to disease. And there are other mechanisms, I won't go into them, but even the nerve cells and other cells in the brain have developed natural ways to resist this that we're just starting to find through genetics, which is really exciting, but also suggests there are other ways we could develop therapies. And so we call all of these diseases tauopathies because we think they're caused by tau, or at least there's a lot of tau that's associating in the brains. And we consider PSP, CBD, other Pick's disease, which is a form of FTD, and people who have tau mutations in their family as primary tauopathies, because we think tau is really the only protein that we can really identify that's causing this disease. Whereas in Alzheimer's disease, which is somewhat more common, we also have other proteins like amyloid that cause the disease. And what we've learned over the years is that tau also probably plays a role in even things like Parkinson's, even though you don't find it accumulating in most Parkinson's brains. Genetics tell us that it's probably also important, even for other diseases that we don't typically consider to be caused by tau. What is tau? Well, initially we thought tau over here in this upper left-hand corner was a protein that stabilized these tubes within cells. If you think of a neuron that looks kind of like a tree with a trunk, the tubes, these called microtubules, were kind of the glue that held them together, was tau. But recently, over the past decade, it's been learned that tau gets all over the cells and does all different kinds of things in the cells, including helping with communication at what's called the synapse between different cells. It helps with energy production in the energy producing parts of the cells called mitochondria. And it even seems to bind to the genetic material in the cells and help to stabilize it. One's called ribonucleic acid, or RNA. And actually it turns out that tau binds very strongly to that and may help to regulate that. So maybe one of the reasons why tau is so central to all these diseases is that it's doing a heck of a lot in cells. And if something goes wrong with the tau, that's not good for the cells. Again, I apologize for all this hardcore science, but I just want to explain to you that we've made a lot of progress and some of the things that are affecting our ability to do research. And so this is a representation of the DNA of the tau gene. And basically, tau is a little complicated in neurons because there's different forms of the protein. These different 6 forms are named by the number of portions of the protein that bind to those tubules I just showed you. And there's either 3 or 4 of them. And in CBD and PSP, it turns out that there's way too much. There's an imbalance of this. There's too much of this 4 repeat tau that binds probably too strongly to the microtubules and sticks together. And that's as different in other diseases and in normal people where you have equal ratios. There are also very rare families who get mostly frontotemporal dementia because they have a genetic mutation in the tau gene. There's only a handful of these families around the whole world. But interestingly, there are certain mutations that lead to too much 4 repeat tau, and sometimes the people who have these mutations get a disease that looks like CBD or PSP. And as Robin was mentioning earlier, when people have done large studies, genetic studies called GWASs of neuropathologically confirmed PSP or corticobasal degeneration, the strongest risk factors for getting disease are areas in and around the tau gene itself. So this really supports the idea that tau is central to PSP. And now what we're learning is, that the risk that they're even within the tau gene, there are very specific DNA sequences that are a stronger risk for PSP and CBD. And the same types of genetics are identifying protective alleles, like in Asia, there's a higher incidence, or there's probably a little bit more PSP and CBD than in the West. And that's because they don't have a protective form of tau called H2 there, just in their population. So again, a little bit more science, but it's super cool. And this is an advance just over the past really 8 years. that here's a brain slice, and what people have been able to do using a new technology is determine the three-dimensional structure of that dark brown stuff, the tau that's accumulating. And what we're learning is that the tau forms this very regular three-dimensional structure that is actually also that is specific to different forms of tau disease. So it turns out that the three-dimensional structure is different in Alzheimer's disease and PSP, and even CBD and PSP have a different three-dimensional structure. And this is a really, really, really important finding because it leads to a lot of insights into new treatments. The first tau drugs that we tested for PSP and also for Alzheimer's disease didn't work. But it turns out that they weren't probably targeting this central part of the tau that's accumulating in disease, and maybe that's why the drugs didn't work. So now we're testing newer drugs, and also we're developing new diagnostic tests, which will help us to more accurately and and diagnose these diseases earlier. Then a lot of these are focused on this core structure that forms in PSP or CBD. And I'll mention just an example of that in a minute. So here's an example. Again, these are what's called cryo-electron microscopy structures. And what we know is that this in pink here, there are specific three-dimensional portions of the tau molecule that are exposed in CBD and PSP, but not in, let's say, Alzheimer's disease. And our colleagues at Washington University were able to develop a new CSF test that looks quite specific for CBD tau last year. And we published that in Nature Medicine. So, it suggests that really learning this three-dimensional structure is leading to advances in diagnostic tools and maybe treatments as well. Another study that we just finished, oops, I don't know why it's not showing all the figures here, but anyway, this is for many people, I think, in the Bay Area and around the country who've participated in our research study called the 4-repeat tauopathy neuroimaging initiative. We've been collecting cerebrospinal fluid, and I'll just say that, agreeing to, as Robin mentioned, participate in autopsy, but also to donate cerebrospinal fluid is really, really helpful to us in finding new biomarkers or diagnostic tests that we think can more accurately and earlier and diagnose PSP earlier, and also help to test new drugs. And so this is a new technology called proteomics, where we're measuring either 5,000 or 8,000 different proteins in the spinal fluid, and we can compare those with age-matched controls. And what we can see in blue and red, these are the proteins. There's hundreds of proteins that we can now measure that are highly significantly changed in PSP versus controls or even other forms of neurodegeneration. And so these are leading us to new diagnostic tests that'll make it easier, we hope, in the not too distant future to diagnose PSP and CBD earlier. And the other cool thing about this is some of these proteins, CLC is one of them, we're seeing that the changes, even in autopsy confirmed people with PSP, in the changes in their cerebrospinal fluid level of these proteins are directly related to the severity of disease, meaning we might even be able to use these protein levels to measure the effects of treatment. So this is an advance. We just published it a few weeks ago. Really excited about this work, and this is, I think, going to lead to much better diagnostic tests and biomarkers for PSP. We've also done a lot of work to improve MRI diagnosis, and I won't go through all this, but just to say that just using a standard brain MRI that you can do at on a high quality MRI scanner, we can now really improve the accuracy for underlying neuropathological, either PSP or CBD. This number, the AUC, indicates that it's using these MRI technologies is becoming increasingly accurate for diagnosis, at least in research, and not quite there yet for clinical use, but for research to get us to really be confident that in addition to things like these CSF biomarkers, we may be able to diagnose these diseases more accurately and earlier than in the past. So what about treatments? Well, there are two new clinical trials, at least, that are starting in the Bay Area. One is underway for PSP. This is the one that we're enrolling now at UCSF. I don't know actually off the top of my head whether it's going on at Stanford, but is the Amylyx phase 3 for PSP. This is a drug that was initially developed for ALS. It's thought to maybe help with energy metabolism in the cells, in the neurons. Julio Rojas is one of the neurologists in our group at UCSF. He's leading this, and we're actively enrolling participants. Please, if people are interested in this study, this is an oral drug. Feel free to reach out to our team or Dr. Rojas. And then there's a new study that's about to start from a company called Ferrer. And Courtney Lane Donovan, who's a newer, younger neurologist in our group, is going to be leading this. It's not quite approved. I shouldn't probably be showing this, but it is listed on clinicaltrials.gov. If you want to find these NCT numbers, if you look on clinicaltrials.gov, it'll tell you more information about the studies. We expect this study will begin hopefully within the next month or so at UCSF. And this is also an oral drug, a pill that you take, and it's thought to actually affect the chemical modifications of tau. So we're really excited about these new trials for PSP. We're also excited that in 2025, Lauren Vandevried, and also in our group at UCSF, it was announced by the Alzheimer's Association, part the CLOUD program, that they are going to be funding a study sometime, will hopefully begin, if we can get everything together, sometime next year. That's going to be in corticobasal syndrome. I can't say anything more about that, and because we don't have, we're not allowed to say until we have all the details in place. And then, as I mentioned, we're really excited, along with Irene Litvan, Julio Rojas, and Anne-Marie. Irene, many people know, has been a very respected PSP researcher and developed the original PSP research criteria in the 1990s. And Julio Rojas in our group at UCSF, I just mentioned, and Anne-Marie Wills, who leads the PSP program at Harvard and Mass General. We are expecting funding from the NIH to start a new large PSP clinical trial funding that would go on, clinical trial program that called a platform trial that will go on around the country and test up to 3 drugs potentially simultaneously for PSP. And this is what it would look like, assuming we get the money soon, and it's going to take us at least a year to get everything started. But basically, people would be allocated to one of these 3 drugs, and within each drug treatment arm, there's a 3-to-1 ratio of drug to placebo. So the odds of getting a placebo are very small, but what we can do is we can pool all the placebo so that it basically has the same statistical power to test new drugs. And we think that just having the ability to test multiple drugs at a time, and these types of trials, when supported by the NIH and can go on, indefinitely, then we can really accelerate the testing of drugs for PSP. So not quite funded yet by the NIH, but we expect to get the money soon, and we're very hopeful, but we still need even more investment. So I think I'm going to end there, and sorry I went over a little bit, but I'll leave the rest of the hour for questions, and thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Looks very optimistic. I can see why you're excited about all that's going on, Dr. Boxer. We have a lot of questions coming in, and let me start with there are some questions about somebody's asking about platelet-rich plasma therapy, and I remember the last time UCSF and Brain Support Network hosted a major event on research. There was some talk then about young plasma. Could you talk at all about young
Yeah, we
plasma?
did actually do a small trial of young plasma at Stanford. There's some researchers, Tony Weiss-Corey, many people know, at Stanford, has done a lot of work on rejuvenation factors, they're called, that they identified in blood initially from mice, that if you put young blood from mice into older mice, they resist a lot of brain diseases. And so we did a study that was funded by some private foundations a number of years ago. But ultimately it didn't seem to make any difference. That's published, and that was published about 3 years ago. And again, I mentioned Ren van der Reed was the first author. So unfortunately, that didn't work. There are a lot of reports of things that are related, thought to be related to stem cells or brain rejuvenation. Platelet-rich plasma is one of them. I think there may be some evidence, for if you have like certain types of orthopedic or rheumatologic issues with joints. I think some people use that, but there is no evidence that I'm aware of that that's a useful treatment for brain diseases. I think, we all have to be very mindful that there are a lot of charlatans out there that take advantage of patients and families and tell them, oh yeah, well, this platelet-rich plasma is going to be a cure for PSP, but there's really no evidence of that. And many of the people who are saying that have a financial interest and are very unsavory. So same thing with stem cell treatments. They even list them as clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, but those people have done many of those stem cell institutes have actually harmed or killed patients, caused blindness. So you have to be careful that, this is really someone reputable. Um,
Indeed.
so,
Okay, somebody asked a question about GDNF.
yeah, I think it's an interesting technology, interesting growth factor that's been tested. It was, I believe, tested in a trial for Parkinson's quite some time ago. We remain interested in that. There are studies that are being considered. I'm not aware of anything in PSP or CBD right now, but definitely something to continue to monitor and think about.
Okay, someone says that they heard that a nasal spray is being tested for PSP.
We did test many years ago a nasal spray called Davunitide, um, and that was funded by a company called Alon Therapeutics. Davunitide was purported to be a peptide that was a neuroprotective that crossed the blood-brain barrier. It was really in my mind, a milestone clinical trial for PSP because we developed a lot of the methods that are now used in PSP clinical trials through that international trial that I led. But the trial was negative. Clearly, the nasal spray did not work. There's been some confusion recently because the person who invented that and still owns the patent has claimed that she got access to the data set and claimed that there was some effect that we missed, but that was not accurate. And unfortunately, she announced that, but I don't think that's true.
Yeah, and I think that was the trial you were mentioning where later research showed that there was this special architecture being formed and the Davunitide just wasn't addressing this other area.
Well, I think, there were questions whether Davunitide even got into the brain.
Mm.
So that was quite, did it really go through a nasal spray into your brain? I'm not sure. It wasn't clear that was true. But what we can say definitely, without any doubt, it had no benefit for the patients. It was as negative as a negative trial could be.
Yeah. Another thing somebody asked about is salsalate.
Yeah, that
Remember
was
there was a
another
study.
small trial that we did that was funded also by some private foundations. That was also published along in the same paper with the young plasma. Salsalate is a drug that's been approved. It's related to aspirin, and it was theoretically based on animal studies done by my colleague Lee Gann, thought to maybe uh, alter tau so that it was less toxic, but we found no benefit at all in the PSP patients who took it. So unfortunately.
Okay. There have been some questions here about the MRI technologies. So you said that the MRI technologies are making great leaps in terms of research, not yet applicable to the clinical setting. Is it a standard MRI, or is there something new technology on top of a standard MRI, or what's different about this?
Yeah, so these measurements were done on what's called a 3 Tesla MRI, which is something that's now quite standard. They were all the MRIs were done on research quality scanners, but theoretically, this could be implemented if, like a company or a radiology group wanted to build a version of for clinical use, it could be done on standard MRIs. I think that's something that, the community could lobby for, and I think it would be quite feasible, actually. It's just, again, there's this, you saw that I showed the first slide. Something that frustrates me is there's a lack of awareness about PSP and CBS. It's really not, just as common as ALS, but ALS is a household name. But people don't know about PSP, and I think if more people knew about it, maybe we could have more traction with getting these things into the clinic.
Yeah, indeed. Um, let's see. Somebody asked, this is not quite a research question, but about the hummingbird sign. Is that
Yeah.
definitive for helpful for PSP diagnosis?
In the current research criteria for PS, the hummingbird sign is basically some volume loss in the brainstem or the midbrain of the brain mostly, and that's very classically associated with PSP. It turns out that people have done studies over the past 15 years, and you also see it in corticobasal degeneration. So it's not specific to PSP, but it's very common in PSP and less so in corticobasal degeneration. But that paper I showed you with the measurements of the MRI, that's part of what it's measuring. But what our colleague in Spain who did this work showed that combining that with other volume measurements in the brain really improves the accuracy, and particularly the accuracy for CBD neuropathologically and for differentiating PSP from CBD.
Right. Okay. Someone asked, is there an expanded access or compassionate use component to the PSP platform trial, like an ALS?
Not at this point. This is the PSP platform. Hopefully it will be funded soon. Is really a standard. Expanded access is also referred to as compassionate use. And in that case, you can, if you can convince the people who own the drug, like the company, and to give it to you, and there's a physician who can do it, and it can all be paid for. It can be expensive. Then you can get an experimental drug outside of a clinical trial. And the new ALS funding bill that was passed by Congress includes a lot of money because expanded access is so expensive, includes a lot of money to support that. We don't have that kind of money. We have just enough money to do that clinical trial. It would be terrific if that were an option. One of the challenges, having tried to do expanded access for patients many times, is that even if a patient wants it and the treating physician wants the drug, it's really up to a company to give it to them. The company doesn't have to agree, and generally they don't. So that's part of the issue. But we think, my belief is that if we incentivize companies by providing funding, that's what we're trying to do with this NIH-funded platform trial. If we lower the risk to them to investing in treatment for PSP, they'll be more willing to do that. So yeah, it would be nice if we had similar resources. And that's what bugs the heck out of me, that PSP is just as common and,
Yeah.
probably a combination of PSP and CBS are more common than Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS. And yet there's just a fraction of the funding for research and for expanded access. So if anybody knows politicians, or, get out there and tell them to, pass a bill to get, an equal amount of funding, because it really does make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, there are, of course, several types of PSP, and the most common type is Richardson syndrome. That's the type that is included as in these studies, right? That's you only want
Yeah.
Richardson syndrome folks. Could you give a little
Yeah, the
synopsis as
reason
to why?
why, well, I should say that corticobasal syndrome, the syndrome that's classically associated with corticobasal degeneration, neuropathology, what you see at autopsy, is sometimes caused by PSP. So if we do a trial in corticobasal syndrome, we're probably also including some PSP patients. Um, but there are other forms of PSP sometimes that are more rare than, yeah, and I see somebody commented the new national plan to end Parkinson's will, I think there is some money hopefully we'll get for PSP out of that, but still it bugs the heck out of me. They need a separate PSP um, law, because I think we're just going to get, the crumbs from that National Parkinson's Act. So anyway, I'm sorry. So the other phenotypes, the other forms of PSP, rarely PSP presents as a non-fluent aphasia, as a pure gait disorder, even a lot, and probably the most common non-Richardson's or the not atypical presentation is something called PSP Parkinsonism, where people initially look like they have typical Parkinson's disease and may even respond to levodopa treatment, which is the core of Parkinson's treatment, but then over time they become unresponsive and they start to develop more classic symptoms of PSP. So it's a lot more challenging to do clinical trials for these individuals. Not that we don't want to. We think that once we have better biomarkers, it will be a lot easier, but to do those clinical trials. Right now, we're very, very good at doing clinical trials in PSP Richardson syndrome, which is also the most common form. And that's why we focused on that for this NIH grant, because it's hard to get money from the NIH, and we have to convince people that we can really do a good job if we're getting that amount of money.
And similarly for corticobasal syndrome studies, you're looking for people, those people with corticobasal syndrome that are more likely to have CBD pathology upon autopsy.
Or PSP, yeah, that's
Or
hard for
PSP.
us to
Okay.
sort
Yeah,
out.
tough.
But a
Yeah.
major advance that I'm very proud of is that our group made over the past few years, also through that Fortney study, um, was their new blood test. So about 30% of people who have corticobasal syndrome actually have an atypical form of Alzheimer's disease as the cause. It's not caused by CBD or PSP. It's caused by, strangely, Alzheimer's disease. But now we can use blood tests that are available clinically for Alzheimer's disease to rule out those patients, which allows us to have sufficient diagnostic certainty to do a trial in corticobasal syndrome, where we can be quite confident that the people have true tau, 4 tau pathology, either CBD or PSP. So that was an advance just over the past couple of years that we did.
And that was also part of that CSF proteomics.
That's actually a blood test. So
Okay.
that's way farther advanced. These blood
Wow.
tests actually are now clinically available. Us clinicians use them who take care of Alzheimer's disease, because if these blood tests are abnormal, it tells you that someone likely has Alzheimer's disease. But conversely, you can use that to rule out Alzheimer's disease as a cause of corticobasal syndrome, which is also quite helpful if you want to test the treatment for
Absolutely.
corticobasal
Yeah.
degeneration.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and so could you clarify if lumbar punctures are required in the AMLEX study or the Ferrer study?
I
You
don't
know?
recall honestly off the top of my
Okay.
head.
Okay.
They may be for at least one of them. I don't recall. So, but you could check back. You could check with our team, or you could look online for the AMLEX study, which is now actively recruiting. We've enrolled a number of people at UCSF. And the Ferrer study, it's up on clinicaltrials.gov. And we hopefully will be in recruiting within a month or so if everything goes well.
Right. And just as you said about UCSF for one of the 2025 studies, I can say Stanford cannot comment as to whether Stanford is participating in the AMLEX study. So stay
Okay.
tuned. You
All
know
right.
how that goes.
Well,
Um, yeah. So let's see. Somebody asked, what are the benefits of lumping PSP and CBS together, or are there only disadvantages?
well, the benefits are that, as I mentioned, there's some people who are clinically very similar. So in a clinical trial where our ability to detect a treatment effect is often directly proportional to the number of people we can enroll in the trial. It makes it easier for us to enroll a lot of people. Also, it allows potentially CBD patients to benefit from a treatment for PSP or vice versa. And it's been really hard. I think there have been very few trials done in CBD. I apologize. There's someone with a power tool outside my window. Sorry, I apologize for the noise. So that's one of the benefits. The other thing is that some of the new treatments that are being tested or developed for tau disorders are likely, theoretically should work equally well in PSP and CBD. So why not test them in both at the same time?
Yeah, right. Okay. Um, if someone you've kind of answered this already, but I'll ask it. If a patient has been diagnosed with CBD and some PSP symptoms, would they qualify to participate in a PSP study?
I think, it really depends on the details. I think there are strict criteria for clinical trials, so it's worthwhile reaching out to, the team, our team, or if Stanford begins enrolling, um, to discuss that. It's hard to tell you, without knowing all the details.
Right. Someone asked, how can we find out when those 2025 studies, you mentioned two studies, the Van Vrede and the Litvan study, the platform study,
Well, the
how
platform
can
trial is my study, but
yours?
Dean is
Okay.
part of the team. So,
Okay.
yeah, sorry, not to take too much credit, but
No, you deserve all the credit.
yeah, so we hope that they will begin later in 2025. It's very hard to get these studies off the ground. But I think we're highly optimistic it's going to happen. We've been told for the platform trial that we should get the money from the NIH before the end of September. So once that money comes in, we're off to the races. But just to get everything, the infrastructure built and plan everything will take a
Yeah.
year at least.
Yeah. And I can just speak generally about that. Certainly ask us at Brain Support Network because we monitor all of these studies going on and we try to help people enroll wherever we can. And um, Dr. Boxer mentioned the Fortney study, the neuroimaging study. We've sent many people to UCSF because that's very powerful research. So
Yeah, and unfortunately, that study is now over because we that evolved into the new platform trial. I felt
yeah.
it was, I personally feel strongly that the ethics of doing observational research is becoming more problematic because I know from my experience taking care of people that most patients would really like to try some sort of treatment. And so I didn't feel right continuing that observational study, and instead, that's why we focused on the platform trial grant.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Fortney study still served to incredible value, still provide incredible value.
Yeah, and all of those data are freely available and have been used by researchers around the world. So we're very grateful to everyone who participated, and thank you,
Uh,
Robin, for helping us.
oh, yeah, it's our pleasure. Someone asked, are there any studies to see if there are any common threads, lifestyle, environment, etc., for causing PSP?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interest in that survey work. Irene Litvan, actually, we mentioned her. She had a grant a number of years ago where they were doing epidemiologic studies, and interestingly, some of the same risk factors for Parkinson's, some drinking well water, being exposed maybe to certain heavy metals or pesticides seem to be risk factors as well. For some reason, PSP was associated with lower levels of education, but I would my impression is that's not really due to the education. It's due to the people with lower levels of education more likely lived in rural areas on farms and may have been exposed to those toxins. And then I've, many people may have heard of this study that was done in France a number of years ago, but there's a small town on the border of France and Germany. Larry Golby was involved with the study, and I apologize to the French researcher who led it because I can't think of her name. But there's a small town where for hundreds of years there was a factory in that town that made dyes, like for clothing, dyeing clothing different colors. And in those dyes, they were putting heavy metals. And there are a lot of canals in the town that would flood during the winter when it rained or snowed a lot. And a lot of the people in the town would grow vegetables. And there was a tenfold higher incidence or much higher incidence of PSP. And there are a lot of PSP cases in that one town. And they studied the people, and the conclusion is that they were growing the vegetables. The vegetables were taking up groundwater that was contaminated from that factory that likely contained maybe arsenic and chromium. So I think that's pretty strong evidence that there could be an environmental risk factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, let's see. Have you tested or has there been any research on lifestyle changes and their impact on progression?
Um, I think not so much, no. I mean, I think the main the clearest research though, I would say in terms of non sort of pharmacologic or non-drug related treatments for PSP is that's been supported by I think increasing numbers of studies is that physical, occupational, and speech therapy is really helpful. And in fact, the only clinical trial that I'm aware of that was actually done in Italy, where people actually improved over the course of 3 to 6 months, was involved a very intensive rehabilitation program. So I think that it's really, if at all possible, doing physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy, if indicated, could really be helpful.
Okay. Is there any research on improving the experience of donating CSF? I did it once and was very uncomfortable with a 9-day headache.
Yeah, and we really appreciate your doing that. Thank you. Uh, Yes, there is some improvement. There are better needles now. So the reason often why people would get a headache, or people like you got a headache, is that there was a persistent tear in the membrane around the spinal fluid and the spinal cord that takes a while to heal when you have a headache. Now there are better needles and better ways that are much less likely, excuse me, to produce a tear, so the rate of headache should be going down. Still, there is that risk, and we appreciate it that you were willing to do that. And it does, you can see, we think in terms of finding new blood tests or new diagnostic tests, CSF is incredibly valuable to us for that research.
Yeah. Related to that, could you speak about brain donation?
Yeah, brain donation as well. So, the only way we can be 100% certain that someone had PSP or CBD is if we look at their brain at autopsy. And so it's super important to do brain donation and get an autopsy diagnosis for research, but also I think maybe for peace of mind for many families to be certain this is what it was. And then also, we have a lot of researchers from around the world who look at the brain specimens. We're doing a lot of research with biomarkers now, where we look actually at brain tissue. So some of those things that I showed you in the CSF, we're now trying to understand why are they changing in the CSF, and we can look at the tissue from people who are generous enough to donate their brains for research, and we can look for those proteins and what's happening to them in the PSP brain tissue. And that really is helping us to learn about what causes PSP and why those might be good tests, diagnostic tests.
Yeah, and I should say if you're a participant in research at UCSF at the Memory and Aging Clinic where Dr. Boxer is, absolutely consider donating your brain or your family member's brain if you're participating in that research. And if you're not, please contact us at Brain Support Network because we're happy to help all the non-UCSF folks out there, and we do brain donations all the time, as does the UCSF. Okay, let's see. Um, Somebody says you're doing a great job, Dr. Boxer.
Thank you.
And this is a sweet question. I like this, so I'm going to ask because I'm curious about it too. How did you become interested in PSP and CBS, Dr. Boxer?
Well, to be honest, it was a patient who I took care of. I did my residency, my neurology residency at Stanford, and I had this patient who I really cared about a lot. He was just a really wonderful guy, and very much loved by his family from, the South Bay someplace, and had some really strange initially behavioral symptoms that we couldn't understand. Like, why was he acting this way? This was like 20 years over, a little over 20 years ago, before we understood frontotemporal dementia or PSP nearly as well as we do now. And I took care of him throughout my residency. And then when I moved to UCSF for fellowship, I also took care of him. Um, and it turned out eventually that after a few years of behavioral symptoms, he developed the classic movement disorder of
Mm.
PSP. And so I got to know him and his family very well. And I found, very compelling. I felt like not many people were working on this. And I thought, both from a patient care perspective, but from a research perspective, it's a super interesting and exciting disease for developing treatments, because I think we really can make a difference for people. We just need to invest more and do more to do it.
Yeah. And related to that, somebody says, I haven't seen this documentary, but are you saying that PSP needs a documentary like For Love and Life, No Ordinary Campaign to raise awareness, political and financial support?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know that documentary, but I think
Mhm.
yes. There's a congresswoman. I don't know how many people have heard about this. Jennifer Wexton, I believe. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing
Yeah,
that
that's right.
correctly.
Yeah.
Who announced
Mhm.
that she had PSP. She's been incredibly courageous in sharing, her experience and speaking publicly, despite having trouble speaking about this. But we need, a lot more people. And yes, I do think that documentaries. I think there's a lot of unconscious bias in our society against people who are older, people who have movement disorders, people who have trouble speaking clearly. And that's part of the reason why PSP is sort of under-recognized, ignored, and clearly understudied and underfunded. And so I think we really need to change that narrative and understand why this is so important. And that, PSP, the other thing that we're learning from neuropathology studies, brain donation studies, is that in older people who die, about 10% of healthy elderly people, this is from a study at the Banner Health Institute in Arizona, have evidence of PSP, very early PSP in their brains. So it's likely that many people, if they live long enough, could also get PSP. So it might not even be as rare as people think, but
Mm.
it's just not recognized and doesn't get the funding or attention that it should. And I think, yeah, any sort of advocacy or awareness would really help.
Yeah, okay. Someone asks, do we know why there are so many variations in the degeneration associated with these diseases? Why do some people decline quickly and some people decline slowly?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're learning actually over the past 5 years. Part of it is probably genetic influences. So there have been a couple large genetic studies where people looked at how long individuals survive with PSP or how quickly they progress. And two of those studies were led by my friends and colleagues in London, Ed Jabari and Hugh Morris. And they found that there's a gene called TRIM1117 that's present in all neurons. And what it appears to do is it's like part of the garbage disposal system in nerve cells. And it basically helps to dispose of the toxic forms of tau protein. And so it's likely there's some genetic differences in some people that in that particular gene, and if they have a protective version, they seem to survive a lot longer. They also did another study that surprisingly, there's this gene called LRRK2, which is associated with Parkinson's disease. And that also appears to maybe play a role in a different garbage disposal system called the lysosome in the cells. And there's also a link in LRRK2 to disease progression in PSP. It's different than the risk factor for Parkinson's. It's a totally different genetic risk factor, but it's the same gene probably. So part of the reason we now have an answer to that question is genetics. Some people are genetic, and I mentioned that earlier, some people are genetically resistant to PSP.
That's very interesting. And do you find that same genetic resistance to CBD, or is it specific to PSP?
The trouble is that it's been hard to do these large
Yeah,
epidemiology studies and survival studies in CBD due to the heterogeneity of the underlying
yeah,
causes. So
yeah.
we don't have as good data, but I think this is interestingly the same gene that was initially identified in PSP, TRIM1117, just last year was identified also likely as a protective factor for Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, all right.
So I suspect it would also be the same for CBD.
Yeah, and as I recall from lest anybody get alarmed that they might be a carrier of some genetic mutation. Well, maybe you can disabuse
Yeah, I
people of that
mean,
notion.
they're literally only you know, small, less probably 100 families around the whole world where there may be a few more than that, but a few hundred in the whole world who have these mutations in the tau gene, and the vast majority of those mutations don't cause PSP. So, um, you know, it's very highly unlikely that there's any strong genetic risk factor. There may be a constellation of 10 or 20 or 50 different small risk factors that maybe in conjunction with an environmental exposure might predispose people to PSP, but I really don't think it's a significant worry that if one person in the family has PSP, that their children should be worried that they're going to get it too.
Yeah, okay. Um, let's see. Somebody says, are there any new developments specific to CBS?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are. Number one is, that we can use this blood test for Alzheimer's disease to get a much better, accurate diagnosis. We can rule out cases who have Alzheimer's disease. And conversely, if Alzheimer's disease is the cause, they might even be able to be treated with some new treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So that's important. Two is that paper I showed you that we did in conjunction with the WashU group, where there are those specific tau structures that we can now detect in cerebrospinal fluid that are specific to CBD. And that may eventually prove to be a good diagnostic test. I know our colleagues are even trying to develop a blood test based on that for CBD. And then, the availability of these biomarkers, we think specifically for CBD, would increase our ability to test new treatments specifically for CBD. But even without those newer biomarkers being available, we feel and the people who reviewed Ren Vandervriet's grant felt that we're sufficiently advanced now that we could really do a small trial at UCSF of a new drug for CBD.
Okay, someone asks, is there any evidence of uh, psychotropic meds or antidepressants causing PSP or
No.
CBD?
In
Okay.
fact, just the opposite. There is some evidence from a group at Cambridge that there are maybe some antidepressant drugs that theoretically in cell culture models of tauopathies could even be protective. But I doubt that that's true in humans, but there's no evidence that those drugs would be associated.
Okay. Someone asked, are you aware of AV951 from AbbVie?
No, I'm not, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. As a person with CBD, how often would you recommend I have an MRI?
I think it's really up to whoever's taking care of you. It doesn't, I think after the initial diagnosis, my own opinion is it doesn't really help because many people, interestingly or not, in my experience, many people with CBD, they look much better in their day-to-day life than their MRI looks. So I don't know what the MRI is telling us at this point, other than diagnostic information, and then maybe in the setting of a clinical trial. But clinically, I think what's much more important is how the patient feels and is doing, and how their family feels they're doing, than a
Yeah.
brain scan.
Okay. As I mentioned, we're really lucky to have you in the Bay Area. UCSF Memory and Aging Clinic is a Cure PSP Center of Excellence, and Stanford is also a Cure PSP Center of Excellence. For those people who live in areas where there are no centers of excellence for PSP, do you have any general advice on how to how to cope.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I mean, I know this is a really tough disease for people. Um, I think Cure PSP and also the Brain Support Network have a lot of really helpful information. Cure PSP has support groups. They also have social workers and other mechanisms to help families and all or connect. And I think Brain Support, Robin, you do this too, connect
Yes.
family members or patients with other family members who've been through this. And I know that's been very helpful for some of our patients. So that helps. I think also, if the physician who's taking care of someone isn't an expert, at least in movement disorders, but ideally has some familiarity with PSP, if there is a way to get into one of these centers like ours where people are quite knowledgeable, that's probably helpful too.
I think even, if you don't live in an area where there's a center of excellence, even if you can make one trip to see an expert physician like Dr. Boxer, or there are others in the US, even if you can make one trip, I think that trip is hugely valuable uh, to families and gives information to the treating physician as well. I think that'd be very helpful.
So
Okay, we're
I'm
at
so
the end.
sorry I have to jump off
Yeah,
the
we're at the end of our time, and we have
yeah,
so many more questions, but no more time. Thank you so much, Dr.
no
Boxer. It's
problem.
been
Yeah.
fantastic.